Hey there, we're on Chapter 5, the United States Constitution. You've already watched your somewhat entertaining video about constitutional history and the Constitutional Convention, so let's get into the substance of the Constitution. Let's take the Commerce Clause first. I'm looking over here at a copy of my Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 3, it says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That provision of the Constitution may arguably be the largest grant of power in the history of the world. One entity, the United States Congress, has the power to regulate the largest economy in the history of the world. So that grant of power is made even larger by the fact that through the years, the courts have interpreted what interstate commerce as very broadly. And they have come to conclude that, in essence, interstate commerce is not only commerce that goes from state to state, but anything that even moderately affects commerce that goes state to state. So, by the time the 1990s came along, many political scientists thought that Congress could use the Commerce Clause to justify any of its legislative actions. Congress, under the Constitution, can only pass laws in areas that it is allowed to legislate in. The Constitution clearly points out that the national legislature, Congress, is a legislature of limited power, and those powers have to be specifically found in the Constitution. Well, what Congress has done is it has continually, over the past, let's say, 70 years, relied over and over and over again on the Commerce Clause to legislate in almost any area. So by the time the 1990s came along, there were three minor cases, and you can look at them in your textbook, that nibbled away at the edges of the power of the Commerce Clause. Let's go to the First Amendment, and let's see, the First Amendment says that Congress shall grant freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition of the government. Let's talk about speech here for a moment. Now, speech, of course, includes words, but can we communicate without words? And I'm not talking about sign language here. Let's take the case of Mr. Johnson in Texas versus Johnson, a 1989 case. Mr. Johnson was in a city that a national political convention was taking place. Lots of press was around. And he walked out among the press and took out a United States flag and burned it. This convention was taking place in the state of Texas, and Texas had a state law which made it a criminal offense to burn an American flag. So Mr. Smith was convicted, and at his trial, his attorney said this conviction violates his First Amendment rights because Mr. Smith was, in essence, speaking. Now, he didn't say a word, he just burned the flag. A very controversial 5-4 case, the Supreme Court said yes, he was just speaking. We're not quite sure what he wanted to say, but it was speech. Now, since this is a business course, how about corporate political speech? One day, Massachusetts said, we're so tired of political contributions affecting our politics that we forbid any company from giving anything to any politician. Well, the companies said, well, that violates our free speech because that's how we speak to politicians. We give them contributions. And the Supreme Court said, yes, Massachusetts' law was too broad and that you couldn't just outlaw all giving to all politicians. When we're talking about limiting commercial speech, we can talk about advertising. Let's take cigarette advertising, for example. As you well know, cigarette companies have been banned from advertising on television or the radio by Congress. And the three criteria that Congress had to meet that is set forth by the courts, the ban had to implement a substantial governmental interest. Of course, the government has an interest in not only the health of its citizens, but in reducing medical costs, which it often pays for. Second, the legislation must directly advance that interest. One could rationally assume that the less cigarette advertising, the fewer people would smoke. And second, the ban must go no further than is needed to accomplish that objective. So cigarettes were banned on television and radio, but they weren't banned in print ads, for example. Freedom of religion. Under the Constitution, the Congress cannot establish a state religion nor prevent your free exercise of your chosen religion. What about Sunday closing laws? There are just about in every state there's some activities that can't be done on Sunday. For instance, in many states, car dealerships cannot be open on Sunday. Is that establishing a religion because Sunday is an official religious holiday? No, the courts have decided that simply is not going so far as to establish a religion. What happens when, talk about the free exercise clause, what happens when you have a sincerely held religious belief that butts right up against criminal law? Let's say that your sincerely held religious group thinks that the deity is served if you sacrifice 20 dogs and cats every Sunday to the deity. Well, everywhere